And thank you all so much for joining us. Best-selling author Karen Thompson Walker will discuss her new novel, The Strange Case of Jane O, in conversation with best-selling author Angie Kim in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So Angie Kim moved as a preteen from Seoul, South Korea, to the suburbs of Baltimore. After graduating from Interlochen Arts Academy, she studied philosophy at Stanford and attended Harvard Law School, where she was the editor of the Harvard Law Review. Angie's debut novel, Miracle Creek, won the Edgar Award and the ITW Thriller Award and was named one of the best 100 mysteries and thrillers of all time by Time Magazine and one of the best books of the year by Time Magazine, The Washington Post, Kirkus Reviews, and The Today Show. Happiness Falls, her second novel, was an instant New York Times bestseller and a book club pick for Good Morning America, Barnes & Noble's, Bellatrist, and Book of the Month Club. And I have it on good authority. She's currently working on her third novel. Certainly want to introduce Karen Thompson Walker. Her New York Times bestseller, The Age of Miracles, has been translated into 29 novels and was named one of the best books of the year by People Magazine, the Oprah Magazine, and Financial Times, among other publications. Her second novel, The Dreamers, was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and was named one of the best books of the year by Glamour, Real Simple, and Good Housekeeping. Born and raised in San Diego, Karen is a graduate of UCLA and the Columbia MFA program. She is an associate professor of creative writing and lives with her husband, the novelist Casey Walker, and their two daughters in Portland, Oregon. So, folks, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Angie and Karen for joining us here tonight. And Angie, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Yay. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Karen, I am so excited to be here. All right, so I'm raising a glass to the first week of The Strange Case of Jane O being out in the world. It came out last Tuesday. So this is not champagne, it's red wine, but whatever, it's fine. Okay,
I like it.
I'm just gonna, all right.
I'll toast with
And
my coffee.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because it's earlier for you. You're in California, right. It's 3 hours earlier. So I was telling Karen earlier that I'm such a huge fan, and this is so special to me because, and it's very personal for me, and that I'm getting to be in conversation with her because The Age of Miracles was one of my favorite novels, and I read it when I first started writing fiction. So I came to fiction writing very, very late, and to creative writing in general, very late in life, in my 40s. And I started really writing fiction in the summer of 2012, which is, of course, when your book came out. Mm-hmm. And so many people recommended it to me. And, you know, like everybody at Politics and Prose which is my local bookstore, was just like putting it into my hands. And it was that first person retrospective voice of Julia, who is 11, I think, at the start of the events that she describes. And it gave me a way into a young teenage voice for the first short story that I ever wrote. And that was published in 2013. And that became the character and the voice for Happiness Falls, which is my novel that just came out, Mia's voice. And so this is really personal for me. I feel like it was like a gift from, you know, directly from you that led me to discover this voice that, you know, was my second novel. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, that's amazing. And I think not that I felt that it came from, but I felt some kind of kinship when I was reading Happiness Falls. Not that I knew, but just like, wow, we're interested. Yeah, we have some kind of similar interest. So I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, and like I'm gonna insist. I hope that it's okay that you read for us a little bit. But before you do, I want to fangirl a little bit about this amazing book, just because it has gotten such rave reviews. Like every review has been starred, which is, you know, something that we all dream of. And some of the things that, you know, I like just jumped out at me, like Kirkus in their starred review, calling it an exhilarating and riveting must read and then read again, which I loved because that's exactly what I did. I like finished and then I was like, what? And then I went back to the first page and reread again. PW in its starred review saying that it's mesmerizing and alluring vision of how personal history and memory intertwine. Book lists calling your prose masterful, which really was. Library Journal saying it's perfect for readers who like their literary fiction with an edge of psychological mystery. So, and New York Times calling it a novel of metaphysical mysteries. So cool. So with that, I wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind just telling all the people here in the audience who, may not have read it already, because it's only been out in the world for like 6 days. Give us your description of what the book is about, and hopefully you can read a little bit of it.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much again for doing this. And thanks to everyone who is here. It's really nice to be able to reach people, all over the country. So yeah, The Strange Case of Jane O, I like to think of it as sort of one part literary novel and one part speculative mystery about memory, motherhood, identity, and love. And it's the story of this new mother named Jane, who is suddenly hit with a series of kind of uncanny and eerie psychological symptoms. So blackouts, hallucinations, a kind of unnerving sense, an inexplicable sense of dread, and eventually some mysterious disappearances. And the book is sort of the story of Jane and her psychiatrist struggling to figure out what's going on with her mind as her symptoms continue to escalate and become kind of increasingly eerie. And so I know I would love to read. I feel like reading on Zoom, there's a risk of it. It's kind of a risk, but I'm going to keep it very short, just to give you a little bit of a sense of the voice, especially at the opening, because I just feel like for me as a reader, until I sort of, read the first page of a book, I can't really tell if it's going to sort of speak to me or not. So I love to just share the opening. So
and also because the voice is, there are two different voices, which we'll talk about later, but the voices are just so personal. And so it really goes to what the novel is about.
Great. Thanks. So I'll just read the first little over a page. Jane came to my office for the first time in the spring of that year. She was 38 years old. Her medical history contained nothing unusual. This was her first visit, she said, to a psychiatrist. She spoke softly, as if concerned about being overheard. She did not remove her coat. She didn't say why she had come, and she had left much of her paperwork blank. But a silence can be useful. I have learned to let one bloom. And so we sat for a while without speaking in my small office on West 96th Street while the city thrummed around us. Jane sat very still on the couch. She kept her arms crossed. Minutes passed. There was a time when I would have found it awkward to sit so long in silence with another human being, but I've grown used to it over the years, the way other doctors do to the nakedness of the body. She wore a gray sweater and tortoiseshell glasses. She was pale and she was slim, very little makeup or none. A simple gold bracelet encircled one wrist, no rings. I'm sorry, she said finally. It's just hard to explain. I noticed then that the skin around her fingernails was red and peeling. In the silence, she began to peel it further. It was obvious that she was in some kind of distress, and I felt suddenly worried for her to a degree that I can't quite explain. Take your time, I said, which is the sort of empty thing I say when a patient seems more in need of kindness than of insight. This was a period when very few patients were coming my way, and so I wondered how Jane had found me, who had given her my name. Finally, she took a deep breath, then spoke. Something strange happened to me, she said. She shifted on the couch, crossed and uncrossed her legs. It didn't make sense, she said. This thing. Stop there.
Muted myself and I forgot. I love that. Thank you so much for that. I think it was when I was reading myself, I got to that. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm obviously not just going to read like the first page just to see what it's about. Sometimes you do that when it comes through in the mail or whatever. And then it was July 4th, actually, when I was reading it. And I just was like, all right, well, I guess I'm not working today anyway, I might as well just read. And I read the entire day and I finished it that night. So
wow.
Very, very cool. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit, since you did read that part, about the voice and the structure of the book. So, the parts, there are 6 parts, and parts 1, 3, and 5 are, in the same voice that you just heard, the psychiatrist named Henry Bird. And, it's clinical, intellectual, but also very curious. And as we go through the novel, I think it becomes more and more confessional and more intimate, which I love. And then the parts 2, 4, and 6, so alternating parts, are by Jane, this, the patient. And I wanted to just ask you to maybe read a little bit from that, just because it's such a different voice, and then just ask you, how did you arrive at this structure and this decision, which is a very, sort of like a fundamental question that you must have decided early on, to have this intertwining thing, and who are they talking to, and all of that sort of stuff. So can you talk a little bit about the origins of it?
Yeah, that's great. I think just so that, like you said, that the conversation will make sense, I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs that are the beginning of Jane's section, so you can hear her voice. And her sections are written to her young son. Her son is a baby. He's one year old. So she's writing to kind of she's sort of writing, imagining, that he will read this someday. And I think this section might explain a little why she's reading that way. Why she's writing that way. June 11th, 2018. Dear Caleb, a psychiatrist has suggested that I write all this down. Telling stories, says Dr. Berg, can have a therapeutic effect. Something about the shaping of experience into a narrative. Something about control. But I'm not used to telling stories, and I've never needed to write things down. I have a good memory, or I did. But I have an urge to leave a record for you, in case I'm not around to tell you all of this when you're old enough to hear it. I feel that something is cracking in me. I fear that I might go missing again. So these letters, well, I hope they'll show you how things were. That's her. They all take that form. Where she's kind of imagining writing to her son. And you're right. It was really like a crucial puzzle piece to figure out, deciding to tell it in these 2 perspectives. And it's something I've never done before. I've never, I've written in a few different styles of point of view, but I've never had 2 first-person narrators. And actually, when the idea first came to me, maybe I'll back up for a moment and say that the idea came to me when I was doing some research for my last book, The Dreamers. I was revisiting the work of Oliver Sacks. Yes. The kind of brilliant and wonderful author and neurologist who wrote these case histories about people living with rare and uncanny brain disorders. Yeah. So I was reading his really beautiful case histories, and I just suddenly thought, what if there was a novel where, what if a psychiatrist, or he's not a psychiatrist, but a doctor with a similar specialty, were to encounter a patient whose eerie symptoms really could not be explained by any of the usual causes? What if they seemed in some sense impossible? So because I began with that first kernel, I was really interested in telling the story from the point of view of this psychiatrist trying to figure out who this woman is and what's going on with her mind or her brain. So that was where my initial kernel came from. And I was sort of interested in initially this idea of what if the whole story was just from the psychiatrist's kind of limited perspective. There was something interesting to me about that. Yeah. But if the further I got into the book, maybe I'd been working on it for 6 months or a year. I just realized what? No, we have to hear from Jane. It's Jane's story. It's what's happening to her. Yeah. There was something that felt not right and incomplete to not have her voice speaking directly. So that's why then I added Jane's voice. But I think once I did that, I immediately got really interested in the possibilities of what that would mean if I'm going to have 2 different first-person narrators whose stories, they do line up, but there's these inconsistencies and this room for unreliability in both. And that started to be a really kind of fun aspect to play with.
I love that. And I forget, I'm trying to look through my notes. There was somebody that I just loved. There was some reviewer who was talking about this book and who said like what they really appreciated about it and loved about it was that sort of there is this question of unreliability, but you get the sense that they're all being truthful. Like they may be unreliable, but they're not lying to us. Right. And that is the one thing I think that we got, other than just getting to know Jane more, and so feeling more invested in the story and feeling that intimacy with her. But more than that, there were some questions just from like a mystery perspective of like, well, is one of the potential answers, when you're reading the description of, the case, essentially the case history from Dr. Bird is like, well, she could just be making all this up and she could be having a little fun. And then you read the diary entries or not diary, they feel like a diary because they're so confessional, but the letters. And then you're like, no, she's really trying to figure this out on her own, which then like really adds this urgency. Like she really wants to be not losing her mind,
Right. Well, I think what I love about for both characters is that mix of like emotional honesty, an attempt at emotional honesty, but they're not. It's like they're, for reasons not always in their own control, they're like failing at it. It's like somehow they're even as they're trying to tell the story, they're not able to tell the whole story.
Right.
And that I really owe that to my love of Kazuo Ishiguro, Never Let Me Go and The Remains of the Day. I love those books, and in particular, he's just such a master of that. Of a type of narrator who is trying to tell their story and yet is sort of half intentionally or almost accidentally not revealing the whole story, or there's like something really fascinating about how he's able to pull it off, and that his books were in my mind as I was writing these.
I love that you said so. In the beginning for those of you who weren't here with us in the very beginning, we did talk about like our feeling like a kind of kinship with our work and things like that. So Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go was like my touchstone that I probably read every single day when I was writing Happiness Falls also. So I love that mystery. And what I got the sense from Jane O is that when I was reading, especially in Dr. Bird's sections and Jane's too, is this sense of, here is a character who's really trying their hardest to figure out what's happening. And it's not because they're being coy with us or anything like that. They're just trying to figure it out in the same way that we are. So in some ways, we are in the same position. We, the readers, are in the same position as the two of them, who are like, okay, this is happening to us. We're getting reports from the police and whatever of what's happened. And then we're like, how can this be happening and why? And it's that how and the why questions that drove my wanting to turn the pages and keep on reading that day and just do nothing else that day, as much as the what, like as much as I wanted to find that out. So let me ask you from a craft perspective then, did you know the whole story before you, or were you finding out slowly as you were writing?
I definitely did not know the whole story at the start.
Okay, good. Yeah. Which I love that.
Yeah, I wrote the opening scene, like the sort of what I read, and then a little beyond of the, a woman showing up in a psychiatrist's office, but kind of refusing or feeling unable to explain herself.
Yeah.
I wrote that sort of shortly after I got the idea, but when I was still working on my last novel. So I wrote that scene like in a day or two. It just kind of captured me. Like, what if a woman showed up who had something strange was going on with her and that she wouldn't explain it? So I wrote that scene, but I did not, when I wrote the scene, know what it was that was going on with her.
Oh, okay.
But, I knew that she was it was like going to be some kind of mysterious symptom that she couldn't explain to herself and that she didn't feel able to say aloud in a way.
Right.
That opening moment, but I did not know what it was going to be.
Well, you not only didn't know the explanation for what was going on, but you didn't even know what was going on either.
No, I didn't know why she showed up.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And so what I love about that is that one of the things that we find out about Jane is, and that's what's all these strange things that are happening to her. A lot of them are memory lapses. She doesn't know herself, like what caused her to, end up in some of these situations that are scaring her. But she also has a real condition of, I forget the actual technical name for it, but the photographic memory. Mm-hmm. And either thing would be intriguing by itself, but it's like the juxtaposition of the two things that's what makes it so heart-wrenching for Jane and so fascinating to the point of obsession for Dr. Bird. So I guess I wanted to ask you, finding out more about the character, that she has this kind of condition and the way that it's really impacted her life and her own personal history. And then what's happening in her life now, which is these memory lapses and the sort of, oppositional push-pull of those things. How did that come about? Did they kind of all both appear at the same time, or did one come first, like the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, early on, so yes, Jane has this, she just her whole life, she was born with basically perfect autobiographical memory. So she can remember, and this is a real thing, called, there seems to be different names and even arguments about how it should be classified, which is one of the fascinating things I learned about, but it's known as hyperthymesia. And it's a real thing. It involves remembering every single moment of your life. So if you remember, my sense of it, and especially the way I imagined it for Jane, would be that you can remember if someone says a date from 2 years ago, you remember that it was a Tuesday and you had a turkey sandwich for lunch, you just remember it like it was yesterday, but for your entire life. And that's just one of those, it's just so fascinating to me that it's very rare, but it's a real human experience that people are walking around with that type of memory. And so I heard about that as a fact around the time that I got the idea for the mysterious patient showing up. Okay. So I think at the very beginning, I thought that was going to be sort of the main situation was this woman,
why does she have this? And
yeah. But I think early on, before I even wrote very much, I just realized that that's like a that's a character. That's who she is. That's not that's not a crisis situation in the present, So I knew there had to be something else going on, but I was really fascinated with how if you had a perfect memory like that, if your memories didn't fade, what would that be like? To, I mean, both, and in some ways the most meaningful, in some ways there'd be something beautiful about it. The most kind of meaningful and beautiful memories would stay, intact forever, but also every negative experience.
Would just the traumatic ones that she experiences.
Yeah. And that is actually, a real thing around trauma is that that people remember those traumatic moments to a degree that you would never remember anything else. And so, anyway, so for her, I was interested in how that would affect her. And so one way it affects her is that she just feels, somewhat isolated from other people because she's constantly, remembering someone she met once and they don't remember her because they only met her once. And then she's also very haunted by, especially negative things that happened to her, and especially one big tragedy that happened about 20 years before the kind of main events of this.
Yeah. And we're not doing spoilers at all. We're going to be, and I just want to actually take a little bit of time right now just to ask everybody who's watching, if you have any questions, we are going to take some audience Q&A. So please feel free to put that in the chat or in the Q&A. And we'll definitely get to them. But please make sure to not send any spoilery if you have read, which I can definitely understand because I read in one day. But if you have, please don't do anything about spoilery. But this is one thing that I was going to ask you about, this question of one of the ways that you explain this book, it's like a combination of so many different things, like I talked about how the New York Times has categorized it as a metaphysical mystery, and some other things said it was kind of sci-fi, and you talked about it being speculative, strange, unexplained psychological phenomena. It's also like a family story because it's about her mother, her becoming a new mother and the relationships that she has around that. But it's also a coming of age story, which is something that was huge, I think, in your earlier books, because she does talk about some stuff that was really important to her that happened when she was in college, and with a particular friend that she had, Nico, and so all of those are intertwined. So I know that you think of it as many different genres, but is there like one that you and your publisher have, like, is there a way that you agreed that you're going to try to call it or try to tell people that it was? What do you think?
I don't know. I think that's with all three of my books. Maybe there's an element of that, it's sort of like people who are most drawn to literary fiction. It's like, it's literary fiction, but people who are most interested in like a sci-fi story, then Random House would be like, well, it is sci-fi.
Yes, exactly.
I don't know. I enjoy playing with that space. I don't know. In my mind, I think of it as I think of it as a mix. I mean, I guess speculative is meaningful to me because it's like, it's not set, obviously it's not set on a different planet. It's not that type of sci-fi, but speculative seems to sort of, in my mind, bridge the gap between like realism and something a little more extraordinary.
Yeah, I think extraordinary is a great way to describe it too. In its kind of like definitional term, like extraordinary, and I also feel like, it's very immersive. And this book in particular, I guess your other books too, because of that speculative nature and that extraordinary nature, it has an atmospheric kind of moody, like something surreal kind of, but like also like Hitchcockian, like that kind of vibe. The New York Times called it a nimbus cloud of vibes, and I really liked that, so I actually wrote that down. I was like, oh, that's good. Yeah, that's what I'm feeling like. I feel like I'm inside a nimbus cloud of vibes here, and I think that's what kind of made me think about that. And we just had a question prop up from Christopher, and it goes to this. So instead of waiting until the end, I'll bring it up. And this kind of goes to something that I was going to ask you a little bit about, which is, and I think David Mitchell is the one who kind of like called it, what did he call it? It's that the whack-a-mole thing. It's the things that you're so obsessed with that even if you like try to push it down and hit it, it'll just pop up. The same thing will pop up. So Christopher asks, is there anything that binds together all your amazing books, perhaps in terms of what interests you or keeps you up late at night, or things you think about every day, and future books too? So that seems like a good, good question to throw in here as we're talking about that.
Sure, great. Thank you so much for the question. I think to me, one thing that binds all three of my books is this interest in the parts of human experience where the everyday or the ordinary and the intimate overlaps with the extraordinary. So in my first book, The Rotation of the Earth suddenly starts to slow down. So obviously it has this, big extraordinary premise, but it's also very interested in like the small moments between people and how something big like that would affect everyday life. In my second book, The Dreamers, is about an imagined contagious disease that's a sleeping sickness. And that one I felt like, again, a lot of focus on like the everyday, how everyday life would be disrupted in a situation like that, but also in a way how it would continue. And in that case, I think sleep and consciousness and dreams are these parts of human experience that are actually so surreal. Like, even though it's real, it's really, they're really extraordinary and not fully explained by science. And then this one, again, obviously it's like a woman trying to live her everyday life, and the psychiatrist too, we learn a bit about his everyday life. But this series of strange events is kind of leading to like an unsettling questioning and a kind of crisis for them. And that's the part that's the otherworldly or extraordinary part. And I think, and maybe just to put a cap on all those things, the thing that it's related, is that I'm really obsessed with is the parts of reality or the universe or human experience that science has not yet fully illuminated, you know? And I think it's different in my mind than magic. It's like I like to write into these spaces where maybe science, maybe they will explain it. Maybe they're just beginning to theorize about it, but there's still a little space that we just can't fully understand yet. And that's so in this book, I loved learning about like the mysteries of memory and human consciousness, and maybe a few other things that might be spoilers, but that are from science.
I know.
Yeah. So I just love working in that territory. And I love, as a reader, reading about nonfiction. It's about like the scientific frontier.
Yeah. And what I love about all three books is that you sort of go there, but without getting necessarily into like the nitty-gritty of the scientific exponent, but you also allude to it, like you talk about what the scientific community is talking about, so you give us that context, but you're really using that as sort of something to make us think about the characters. And again, that's where I think this particular character, Jane, having this memory, this bizarre biographical memory thing, that is really like a key part of what makes her her, and it's part of her identity, and it is like, so you're using that as a way to actually understand her better, and you're using these memory lapses as a way to understand her better. And I guess the one thing that I would say that differentiates this book and makes it like even more personal and intimate to me than even your other two books, and of course I'm a huge fan, is that this is happening to really one person. And so we're really zeroing in. And of course, like in, Age of Miracles, it was, even though it was happening all over the world, we really did focus in the character. And I do think that that's what you do, is that you like zero in on one person. So you help to personalize something that could be happening to multiple people or even the entire world over, but you're really making us curious about the impact that it has on one person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I love how you phrase that.
Yeah,
it is. This one is it's kind of I've written now, every book in a way involves a certain kind of disaster or a certain kind of catastrophe.
Right.
It's kind of a personal crisis, like an internal disaster.
Yeah. And the other thing that differentiates this book is that it's set in Brooklyn rather than California. So what led to that? And California, you are obviously from California.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the setting and why that decision.
Yeah. So I grew up in California and I lived here where I am till I was 23. And then I moved to New York City to go to graduate school at Columbia. And then that's where I lived for about 13, 14 years, depending. I left once for a period, but 13 or 14 years. I lived there mostly in Brooklyn. And so even though for my first two books, it felt really the California setting felt like I just felt the most inspired setting both of those books in California. This time, I don't know. I decided to set in New York when I still lived there, but I left maybe 6 months later, and I wrote the vast majority of the book away from New York.
Okay.
And I think I've noticed something for myself that like it was much easier to write about California. What kind of stands out about California and what is specific and idiosyncratic once I had left. So I wrote those California books in New York, you know, and then I wrote my New York book, almost all of it from Oregon, where I live now. And I think it's because in a way, because my memory is not like Jane's. The more distance I have, the more the kind of interesting moments or interesting elements of New York start to kind of my New York life and my New York experience kind of start to, I don't know, rise up in my memory. And there's something about, getting to use memory. I mean, not that the events of the book are happen to me, but the settings and just the way life feels in New York. It was satisfying to be drawing on memory and not so much on my own day-to-day life as it was, you know, at the time that I was writing. If that makes sense.
Which is so interesting. Yeah, that's so interesting to me because I feel like I've done the opposite. When I was trying to write my last book, I started it really in June of 2020. And I tried to write it like from, you know, as if it were happening before the pandemic, and it was in the middle of the pandemic. And I was just like, I can't figure out what a family's life would be. Just because I was living it and I was like right in the middle of it. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to set it in June of 2020 and I'll revise it later and I'll take that element out of it. And then, you know, it ended up becoming so integral into the novel that I ended up not doing that. But it's so interesting. So does that mean that your next, I guess you haven't left Oregon yet, so you're not going to be, is your next book that you're working on now, that I hope you're working on now, is that set? Where's that set?
Yeah, you know, I think I might be I mean, as of now, I guess I'm breaking the pattern. Because my new book is, I mean, not new, the one I'm at the beginning of writing.
Right.
Is set in the Pacific Northwest. It's not set in like a neighborhood of Portland, which is where I live. It's more about the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. So maybe that is the distance that I need. I still can't imagine writing. I cannot imagine writing something set in
your neighborhood.
Yes, I can't imagine. I don't know why, but probably if I left, then I could. But for now, but anyway, but it is a bit of a change to be writing a book that is my region, in the region that I'm actually living in, but not exactly my day-to-day life.
Yeah. Is that something that you're you can talk at all about, like the broad contours of what you're working on next?
I mean, I think I definitely do feel a bit superstitious. I imagine you might have.
I feel the same way.
So I feel like I probably I won't say much, but yeah, set in the Pacific Northwest, and you know, it has some of the same kinds of ingredients that my books have so far always had, where there's like a lot about the characters in the relationship, but something weird.
Big. Yeah. It's that high concept hook that you hear about and you're like, oh, I can see that happening in our world. And if it did, what would happen? And just gets
high concept again.
Gets you but you know what the concept is, unlike in Jane O, where
I think I know a lot more. I think this one, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, again, I thought of it like 2 years ago, or maybe 3 years ago. So it's kind of been, I had done a little bit of writing, but mostly I was focused on Jane O. But on the side, my mind would be like, oh, and maybe this could happen, you know, in the next novel. So that's one reason I know more now. But I think it's also, I think there's something complicated about, and maybe you have something to say about this, but Jane O does have this mystery. I mean, it's not mystery like a you know, capital M mystery.
Yeah, it's not like a murder and then, you know, there's detectives and whatever, but it's a psychological mystery, right? It's like, it's definitely speculative fiction, speculative suspense. It's, and I do like this metaphysical mystery that I remember your headline for this book was something about metaphysical mysteries. And I was like, I don't know exactly what that means and what other books fall into that category, but whatever it is, it's definitely intriguing and I definitely want to read it,
Yeah. But I think a mystery, it's hard to write a mystery because you have to, like my other books, I wrote them in order and it's like, well, a big thing happened and now I'm going to chart the consequences. And that's kind of the main work,
Yeah.
Not that there's no mystery element, but that the main thing is just coming up with the big thing that happened and then charting the consequences. Whereas Jane O, and I just wonder if Happiness Falls, if you have a similar feeling, I had to, especially because I didn't know the whole thing at the beginning.
Because you didn't know. Exactly.
Like once I figured out what exactly was going on and how it all was going to fit together, then I had to kind of go back and make sure that things made sense. It was just, I just found it to be structurally like a much more challenging process than my last two books. And I think my fourth one that I'm working on now, I think the complexity comes from something else and that the structure is more that a sort of a simpler structure, I think.
Yeah.
Hopefully. So I think I know more about what's going to happen.
Yeah. It's so funny to me because for my first novel, Miracle Creek, it was more of a, like a mystery with a capital M. And I think I used the mystery more like a Trojan horse to just like get in there and give myself a through line so that I knew what was supposed to be happening. But, it was basically like a collection of short stories. It's like 7 different POVs and, and I'm kind of using that as an excuse to explore people's lives and, that kind of thing. But I didn't know what the answers to the mystery was until I was like 3 years into writing the book. And same thing with Happiness Falls too. Like it's about a missing father. Did not know what happened to the father, if he was dead or alive or, like all of these things. And sometimes I would just like call my editor, like, as my deadline is looming and I'm like, okay, deadline is under a year now. And I'd be like, what do you think happened to the father? I mean, it would like list out. He was like, "Well, I think it could be this or this or this," and I would be like, "Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that one."
I mean, I think that it sounds like I had a similar experience of not knowing until far into the book what the situation really was. But I think maybe there's something useful about that because then the writer is very in touch with the reader and what. Like the reader's curiosity, because like rather than knowing everything and trying to like put in hints, it's like if I'm on page 110 and I'm like what is going on with her?
Exactly.
That makes me feel like that's like a reader in a way that's my reader self kind of wondering. And I always with all my books I always want to be really like in my imagination, at least, I really want to be in touch with the reader. I want to be like, what if I was reading this book?
Yeah.
What are you thinking about?
That was my alarm to myself, like saying, let's make sure that people have enough time for Q&A.
Yeah, I would love to answer questions from the audience.
Yeah, and we have some already queued up. And anybody else, please feel free to use either the chat or the Q&A function. And I'll go to that in a second. But just to round up this discussion that we were just having about all of this stuff, I totally believe that that's useful, that not knowing what's happening as the writer, it is really useful. I mean, it's not very useful in terms of like writing efficiently, which it's still not, but it does like it, because I am a procrastinator. So like I will use every excuse to not write. And it does make me feel like, okay, well, if I don't write, like I'm not going to ever find out whatever happened. And I'm curious to know. So there's that. And then there's also like another part. So I did theater when I was in high school. And so I did a lot of method acting and things like that. And the one thing that I always took from that is that even if you say the line the same way, even if you have the same like facial expression, on your face, in your body, if you don't really feel it yourself inside, the audience can tell. And I kind of feel the same way with respect to the emotions that the characters have that when we're writing about them. So when you are like writing about, Dr. Bird and the curiosity and the like frustration that he has because he has no idea what's going on, like that's something that if you are actually feeling a little bit of that as the writer, that comes through. And I think that really helps to make it more of an intense, intense in a good way, reading experience for the reader. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that.
That's great.
All right. So Kimberly asks, did your literary agent, editor, or publisher insist you edit out something that you really didn't want to lose? If so, how did you deal with killing your darling? Ooh, good question. I know some of these people, so I'm curious to know.
Yeah, that's hard to, I think I have a very thorough editor, Kate Medina at Random House, and she has been the editor of all 3 of my books. And I love that. Sometimes you hear things about that editors like don't edit anymore or something, and I'm like, well, that's not my experience.
Yes, no, I know that about Kate. Yeah,
and it's great. She's great, and she's a very good representative of the reader, I feel. So she's very good at honing in on like, this is not quite clear, or I don't think a reader is going to be able to, connect these 2 things because it's been 50 pages or whatever. Anyway, she's very good, very thorough. So I think there's not like a major thing. I think if I feel it, it's interesting because I think you have to remember to be able to kill your darlings.
Yeah.
But also try to like pick the battles of like, but this one actually I really do want you. So I think there were originally some elements of like, part of what was interesting to me about this book is Dr. Bird's voice, like trying to impersonate in a way a psychiatrist's voice. Like I was very interested in that and really trying to pick up the cadences. And maybe now I'm going into a side note, but it's interesting. I did eventually have a psychiatrist read the book.
Ooh.
And yes, and when it was done, I could still make changes, but I was done. And it was a very fascinating experience for me because I was very nervous, obviously, to share. I had just made up a psychiatrist based on a lot of research, but still. Sure. And it's first person. And so to have a real psychiatrist read it was very nerve-wracking. But she had herself a kind of uncanny experience because what she said was she just couldn't believe it wasn't written by a psychiatrist, the parts.
Oh, I love what a great compliment that is.
I know it was very satisfying and even a little uncanny to me, and just reminded me what a strange profession this is to writing fiction, Yeah. But that was great. But I think that gets at there. It was like I was so invested in making it seem like a real psychiatrist. There were probably a few lines that Kate, my editor, was like, okay, we don't need, maybe I was going too much into
the explanations.
Yes. Or like some other psychiatric condition that really the reader doesn't need to know about in this moment. So there's a few, there's not like one that I remember that's so heartbreaking, but yes, I think she helped in a good way. There were some things that maybe I was a little attached to, but I could feel that the reason I was attached to it was related to like the impersonation of a psychiatrist and not necessarily like it's needed for the book,
Yeah, but I will say that those were when he did go off and was like, well, there's this phenomenon called blah, 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 blah here. And I'd be like, oh, this is really interesting. And I'd like mark it so that I would remember to Google it later, that kind of thing.
Oh, that's good. Well, yeah, I didn't cut them all. And she didn't want me to cut them all. Just if I went too far, she would. No.
Yeah. Do you tend to be an overwriter, or so you need to cut back a lot, or are you an underwriter, or are you like the perfect?
I think I am definitely an underwriter.
Really? That's so good.
I don't feel that when I'm doing it, but a lot of edits that I get from Kate are like, can you say a
elaborate?
bit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. My editor in the US, David Ebershoff, is he is a writer himself, and his editor is Kate Medina. So sometimes like he would be like, well, if Kate had this, then I would get blah, 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 kind of, letter from her. So I feel like I know a little bit.
Yeah.
I have a little bit of insight just
Mhm.
through the stories that I've heard. She sounds amazing.
Yeah. It's really, really great.
Okay, so another person, Ellen C, asks if you learn your story as you write it, and right as we talked about it in writer's lingo, that's being called a pantser, writing by the seat of your pants, as opposed to being a plotter using an outline. Do you ever get stuck about what will happen next? Oh, I can answer totally that yes. But anyway, I will let you answer. And if so, how do you help yourself think of the next parts of the plot? Do you ever ask AI for help with plot?
Oh, wow.
Oh,
I just
wow.
learned those terms recently, the pantser and plotter. Someone
Yeah.
just like 2 weeks ago asked, like, was like, "Oh, you're a pantser," and I was like, "Oh, what is that?" Anyway,
Yeah.
so but I like it. I like those terms.
Yeah.
I mean, I think usually for me, something that I need as a writer so far is like an engine in the that's built into the premise of the book. That's
Yes.
like, what is the concept? Like, a thing is happening, and what's the next consequence going to be? Like, even in
Yeah.
this one, even though it has a mystery element, it's
Yeah.
still that was still a useful idea to me because, once Jane is starting to have these specific hallucinations, like,
Yeah.
she's not just going to go on with regular life. Like, what impact is that going to have on her life? So
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't work 100% of the time, but I love to have that engine. And then in the consequence of that is that sometimes I'm fascinated by other books that don't function in that way. I mean, books
Yeah.
that I love, especially like beautiful literary fiction,
Yeah.
where I'm like, how could they even know what the next thing is? Like, it's so I like to have anyway. I like to have that thing, and that can be useful. I would say if this person is a writer, it can be useful to have some kind of engine that's pushing, even if that's not the main interest of the book. It's just like kind of pushing you inevitably to attend to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
consequences. I think that's helpful. And I mean, I definitely get stuck, but I think for me, because it has this engine, it's more like I could think of like 5 things that would happen,
Exactly.
but
Yes.
I'm like, what is it better if this happens, better if this happens? And sometimes, because I'm not just inventing out of thin air. It's more like, well, does she
Right.
keep going to work, or like, does it happen again? Like, does the
Yeah.
psychiatrist say she should be hospitalized? Does he say, it's a little more my
And
mind. I spend a lot of
how
time in.
do you choose? So how do you choose?
Yeah. Well,
Do you sometimes like write out like 5 different, maybe five, not five, but at least 3 or 4, like, and have you ever done that and given it to your editor or your agent or, like your writing partner, whomever, and just sort of say which one seems better to you? Or do you have a strong feel and intuition?
um, I don't write them out and then decide, but it has happened, and maybe especially in this book where I think it's going to go in a direction, and then I start to be like, I don't, this something is not working, and then
Yeah.
I go back to the last point where I felt like it was working, and
Yeah.
I try that other path.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Oh, that's
I've
good.
never shared multiple versions with readers though.
I did that once where I wrote something. I thought it was like really good, and a friend of mine that I was exchanging work with, it was during the pandemic and it was just so hard to write at that time. So we were doing it to like encourage each other. And she was just like, I feel like it's gone off the rails here. And I was like, really? So I kind of went and wrote it sort of like a different way, and I just could not decide. There was something about like the weird way. I mean, they were all weird, but the really weird way that I was just like, so I actually did give both versions to my editor. And I
Oh,
was like, what do you think? And it was just like one chapter or whatever. And he was like, oh, definitely. And he agreed with my friend. And so I
okay.
was like, okay, I guess I don't know. I don't know what's going on with me. But
Hmm.
and I always thought back to that point, like I can always go back,
Yeah,
that they don't know these characters and the story like I do,
yeah.
so
I think there's a lot
and
of
what
trial
about
and error in general
yeah,
in writing. So
definitely. Do you ever ask AI for help with a plot? What about that? That's so
no.
interesting. That would never even occur to me.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of freaked out about AI, so that's one reason why. But I know that it's capable of a lot of really fascinating things. But yeah, but Yeah, I think it's also for me, the reason that I wouldn't also is because something that I love about writing is just like just trying to figure it out on my own is part of the pleasure, even when it's hard.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I totally feel the same way. And and I will say that I'm definitely a pantser, but what I like to do is I like to kind of build a one-page outline as I'm going along. So
Oh,
once
yeah,
I've
yeah.
finished a chapter, then
Mhm.
like writing in this outline, like what just happened. And then, and that way, so by the time I'm done, I have a one-page outline. And every once in a while, if I do get stuck, I look at this like one-page outline. I'm like, okay, at a high level, what is happening in this book, in this story,
Yeah.
and what's going on? Let's remind myself where we are, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I find that when I get to the last like quarter of the book, then I start to feel the need for like a loose outline of like, wait,
Yes,
so what are the like five more things that are going to happen? And
exactly.
how, so then I do a version of an outline, but
Yes.
that's only at the end.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we have time for one final question. If anybody has anything, we have like 2 minutes left. But so if you have any last minute questions, please type them in. And otherwise, I will ask you the favorite question that everybody always has. And whenever people ask me this, I always go, why? Because I can never remember anything any book that I love that I want to talk about. But do you have any? What are you reading right now? Do you have anything that you want to share or anything like that?
Yeah, the book that I'm reading right now, almost done with, is The Antidote by Karen Russell, which is coming out in
Oh,
like only a week now, actually, next week,
yeah.
11th.
Yes.
Yes, and I really recommend it. It's amazing. And yeah, it's set in the 1930s in the Dust Bowl, but it has multiple like fantastical, magical elements, but it
And
has
she, oh,
like
yeah.
kind of illuminating that time period. It's great.
Yeah. And Karen, like her quote for her endorsement quote for your book was like unbelievable. And I love her too. And I remember reading Swamplandia and also her New Yorker story, Finding Olivia. And
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that was a huge influence for finding my character Mia's voice too.
Oh,
So
great.
I feel like even I mean I've only met her once, but but still it's just like all of these influences. And then when you get to meet these people, like I just got to talk to you, it's kind of like, okay, my these are like my kind of on the page mentors that I can sort of say thank you so much to. So I'll say that now. Thank you so much for this wonderful book. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And everybody, if you haven't um, bought this book, then please go to your local independent bookstore and or to your library. That's always, we're being sponsored by I think 50 libraries. So thank you so much for this, and thank you everybody for coming and joining this wonderful talk.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and thank you, Angie. Those were really great questions.
Oh, thank you.